Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round one coverage of my games from the 41st Annual Southern California Open. This is a pretty interesting tournament run by the San Diego Chess Club, which normally holds the tournament down in San Diego, but this year for the first time they were holding it in Orange County. So it was at a hotel near the John Wayne International Airport down there. A pretty convenient location. There were several sections. Let's see, there was a 3-day option as well as a 2-day option. I was playing in the 3-day. There was an open section, an expert section, an A section, a B section, etc. And I was playing in the A section. The time control was game in 100 minutes with a 30-second increment. So you get an increment of 30 seconds every move. This is a FIDE style time control. And the open section was FIDE rated, although the other sections were not. So my section was not FIDE rated. And then I guess we can get right to the tournament. The conditions are pretty nice overall, but I did have a few comments on it. And the first one is that there were a lot of people playing up in the A section. So, you know, at 1837, that was my rating for this tournament, I was expecting to be paired up to face a stronger player in the first round. But instead I was paired down against a kid who was rated 1658. So, yeah, there were a lot of kids playing in the tournament, and they were all playing up, or so it seemed. Anyway, I started off with e4. He went d5. I took, played queen takes, and I played knight c3. So all of these are the most normal moves in the Scandinavian. And here the most common move is queen to a5. But he played queen to d6, which is a respectable second choice and nearly as popular as queen a5. So a reasonable way to play. I continued with d4, and here he went c6. That's a bit of a move wrinkle. The normal move here is knight to f6, and then after knight f3, play c6. But there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with playing c6 immediately. I checked it out with the chess engine and also in the opening book. There doesn't seem to be any special way to punish this move. So I just continued, knight f3, he went knight f6, and now I went bishop e2. So bishop e2 is not the most common move here. The most popular move is knight to e5, and this is how the main line goes. And after knight b to d7, there's some interesting choices for white here. White can play bishop f4, it may be the most normal move. Probably what I would play in that position, trying to maintain a piece on that good outpost square. Also possible is pawn to f4, trying to build up a big pawn center. But the other move that I hadn't thought of, but seems to be very popular in the database, is knight to c4, kicking the queen, and then queen to f3. So white is playing with the queen as well as black, so trying to get the queen out maybe to neutralize black's queen and play for that. White has a slight advantage in space, and maybe the knights are better positioned. It's hard to say, but it seems like there's a slight edge for white in this position, which you'd expect. Scandinavian is not a top-tier opening for a reason, and white does get some kind of edge. Anyway, I played bishop e2, and we're in kind of a rare section of the opening book, although this has been seen. And white still has some edge here. He went bishop g4, I castled, and he went e6. And at that point, we're just out of the opening book. This move has been seen before, knight b d7, and after rook e1, e6. That's a line that's in the database, so it has been played. But there's nothing wrong with the immediate e6 here. I just continue with the bishop to e3. He went queen c7, and I went knight e5 at this point, offering the trade of bishops. It's maybe a decision you could question. I could kick the bishop back with h3 and then try to exploit the position of the bishop on h5, but that didn't seem to yield anything to me, and there's nothing wrong with this move, I don't think. He gets to trade off his bishop, so he does have the situation where he has the pawns on light squares and he has a dark squared bishop, so a solid setup for black with no big structural weaknesses of any kind, although he's a bit behind in development by now. All these moves have cost him a little bit of time. He's got two pieces that he hasn't developed and he hasn't castled, but at the same time, because his structure is so solid, there's no easy way for me to take advantage of that. Anyway, he goes knight bd7. I go rook fd1, and that was just a blunder. So I had to travel for this tournament, and I did spend the night in the hotel, although I slept reasonably well. So I wasn't feeling too bad, but I was maybe a bit groggy this morning. But I played this move without thinking that, or realizing that he can just take that pawn. He can take the knight, pawn takes, queen takes. So a normal move here would be bishop to f4, maybe pawn to f4, also a move, and keeping some edge for white. But anyway, I played this move. I played rook to d1, and he took my knight. And so here I had to think, and search for any way out of my predicament. So you might want to do the same thing here. See if you can spot a good move for white. Okay, pause the video if you want time to think about it. I'm going to give the answer away now. So I found the move bishop to f4, and that turns out to be the best move at the position. So it was a good choice. Now black is a little bit stuck. His knight is pinned. I'm going to win it back one way or another. It's just a question of how I want to win it back. He can't play bishop d6 to unpin because I can take the knight and then I'll be forking two pieces. Maybe that's playable. When I take a knight, he can take my bishop if he moves the bishop away. Anyway, but the move he played, knight to f3 check, was considered by the chess engine as the best choice. So I take, defending my bishop, so the material is equal, and he has to do something about the attack on his queen. But he gets his bishop out, and now his development is okay, just needs to castle. And so I still, I think black is equal here. So even though I was able to recover, I gave up my advantage somehow. So I didn't want to trade bishops especially, but I can't move it away because my pawn on h2 is hanging because of the queen and bishop battery there. So I defended the bishop for a move, and he played rook d8. So he's lining up maybe to take advantage of this pawn on the d file after some trades here. I played the move h3, and the idea of this move is just to make it so that bishop h2 doesn't win a pawn. So now I'm actually free to move this bishop. I was thinking maybe I could move it to g5 rather, pin that knight against the rook there. So he played h6 to prevent that. And now I played c4. That stops his knight from coming into the d5 square, and maybe sets up some ideas of pawn pushes over here to open up the center. So at this point he makes a mistake. Chess engine says he should just take here first, and after I take back, then he should castle. And after queen e3, it thinks this position is okay for both sides, so roughly level position. Instead, he castled immediately, and that's just a mistake. If you want to spot the tactic for white, you can pause the video here and look for it. I'm going to give the answer away now. So a pretty simple one, just bishop takes h6. And I had already been thinking about this move, so I played it pretty quickly because, well, with the queen lined up against the knight and nobody defending it, it's only defended by that pawn. So this wins a pawn. Let's see, he didn't take the bishop. That's probably a good choice. He defended the knight with bishop to e7, and I dropped my bishop back. So at this point, I have a real edge, good prospects for winning the game, all because of that one slip. So I survived my my wake-up call, you could say. That first blunder that I made, I managed to survive, and then my opponent made the first mistake that really leads to a significant edge. But he played on. He did not just cave here. He played queen b6, looking to pressure this pawn and the b pawn. So I just played b3. This is still adequately defended. He went rook d7, maybe thinking to double. I just dropped my bishop back to e3, setting up an attack against his queen, potentially. I probably want to open up the center here, so if I can get the d5 push in with tempo, I think that will be good for me. He dropped his queen back to c7. I played knight to f4 now. I wasn't quite sure where I was going with that, but I'm still looking at that d5 square and thinking of ways maybe I can get that push in. He doubles, and then I bring my knight back to d3. That was the other idea with the knight. So if we go back to this position, yeah, I hadn't thought of that as well. This maneuver with the knight. let's let's do this right. And then from this square, it's looking at either of those two dark squares. So I think that actually is a pretty key maneuver in this game. It's you know, I have the material advantage, but if I just trade down into an endgame, perhaps he can draw it, and you know, I just need to find ways to press my edge, and I think that's a pretty nice maneuver. So knight to f4, rook f to d8, and knight to d3. And I'm relying on the fact that he doesn't want to sacrifice the exchange here. Rook takes, bishop takes, rook takes. Although he does get a bishop and a pawn, and it is a big central pawn, so I do have to be a bit careful here. And at the moment, my queen is defending the rook, so if this d-file opens up, he's not going to be able to win a rook on the back rank. But I do also have to be careful of that as well. Anyway, he went bishop back to d6 here. Taking a look at these dark squares, since it looks like I'm going to be bringing my knight in there. And here I go c5. And c5 is an interesting move. It's not, can't say it's bad or good. It seems to be okay. But it's very committal. You could play on. The chess engine likes the move rook to e1. And I think I like this in retrospect. I keep, you know, control over these squares, so I have the space edge. I get my rook away from any problems on the d-file. And let's see, he might go a6 here and then follow up with h4. That's the chess engine recommendation. Just directly exploiting the lack of pawn cover around the king and trying to intensify. So I think that's a better way of playing than what I did. But c5 is interesting too, and also, well, I still have that edge. So he dropped his bishop back to e7. He could have tried bishop to h2 check. And e5. The chess engine likes this line. So if he had spotted this idea, this still leaves me with a bit of an edge, but this is pretty tricky. Would have been interesting. So by playing e5, he's blocked the queen's defense of this bishop. You know, I had assumed that after I played king h1 here, I knew that he could play bishop h2. I assumed he had to retreat the bishop, and I didn't see what good it would do, but he can play this move. And when I take the bishop, he can push with check. And now the queen can block, so it's not like I'm losing the queen, but he can trade. And then take the knight. And at first, the chess engine likes this for black, but as it thinks about it a bit more, it's still a winning in the game for white. So so this is still okay for me. I just thought that was a pretty interesting line the chess engine came up with there. Now let's go back to the game. So anyway, he didn't try anything crazy like that. He went bishop to e7 and went knight to e5. And this is one of the things I had noticed about this position is I can harass this rook and it has nowhere to go except to d5. And I was thinking maybe this rook is kind of sidelined here because it's really the knight that wants to be on d5. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of maneuvering my pieces around and trying to force black's pieces into awkward positions. And but there is a tactic here, and actually I noticed this, so I guess the earlier wake-up call I got caused me to start noticing the tactics. There's a threat in this position of bishop takes pawn, because after I take back, then my knight is hanging. And I defended. This is another funny move. I defended with rook a c1. I could have just played b4. That's the way to solidly defend. I moved the d rook actually, but I meant I played rook a c1. But b4 is a much more solid defense. Anyway, I played rook a to c1, holding on to this pawn so I could take back with the rook, but that doesn't actually solve the problem here. He could still take. I take, and then he can take here. And, well, he has to trade rooks. I guess. Yeah, he has to trade rooks because the queen is tied down. But after the rook trade, then he can take here. And the rook trade was with tempo. So he can get his pawn back there. That was that would have been a nasty shock. I totally didn't see that line. The chess engine, that would be about equal. The chess engine says I can still keep an advantage here. So if I had stopped at this point, he didn't play this move, but if he had played here, I still have one more chance to keep an advantage. And that is to play knight takes f7, just kamikaze, desperado the knight. And then after he takes, take the bishop. And I stay a pawn up, and his pawns around his king are kind of weak. And so it's still a winning position for me. So rook ac1, I have to say, was not an actual technical blunder, but it's still a mental mistake, another mental slip there, that I didn't see that idea that he can just keep taking here, then my knight is still hanging. So b4 would have been a more solid way to defend that. Anyway, he didn't go for that either. He moved his bishop back. And now I went g4. I was thinking at this point he's probably pretty well stymied. You know, I've got him kind of squashed. His pieces don't have a lot of moves. His rook can't move. His knight doesn't have many great squares to go to. And so I was just going to try experimenting with different things, like, for example, playing g5 to kick that knight away, maybe try and get some pressure on f7 with the queen and the knight, things like that, although it's defended at the moment. He just played queen e7 here, and I didn't see any big follow-up. I didn't like the immediate push, and I have weakened my king side by playing that, so you can also question this move. Anyway, I switched to the other side and played b4. So instead of g4, maybe I should have just played b4 immediately and left the king side solid. Anyway, now he goes knight d7. He's challenging my knight. That was why I guess there was no point in kicking that knight if he's just always going to challenge my knight. But I drop my knight back to c4. I want to keep that knight, and I've got some good dark squares that maybe I can go to. He brought his queen out to f6, looking to maybe trade his way out of trouble. I avoid the trade by going to g3. I went bishop e7, went king g2. I'm just trying to secure my king in case there's something happens on the d file. I don't want the rook to go with check. Let's see, he went knight f8, so he's kind of maneuvering his pieces around, and I push on with f4. Now he goes knight g6. So all these moves seem to have been okay. The chess engine says I'm still winning here, but I have kind of loosened things up a little bit, and this has consequences later. Anyway, I go rook f1 here, so getting away from that d file and putting my rook opposite the queen, and he went knight h4 check. So here is a point where he could have considered the exchange sack, and I really did not give this too much thought, because earlier the exchange sack was not any good, but now that I've opened up my king, he gets a bit of play for this. So if he had taken here, I take black, rook takes. The chess engine says that black, even though being an exchange down, is basically even with threats against my king. I thought I would be able to defend okay with you know, a rook on the second rank there, but and then I do have aggressive intentions against his king side here. But I mean, he just got one pawn back, and I was one pawn up to start with, so the pawns are even, and he just has a bishop against a rook. But the chess engine gives black pretty much equality here, so that's definitely something to think about. You know, always think about those exchange sacrifices, especially if they take out a center pawn like that. Instead, he went knight h4 check. That was the move I was expecting. And I moved my king to h2. And now he went queen g6. And this is also an interesting way to play. He is exploiting the openness in my king side. Having moved those pawns forward, there's some squares that are undefended, and he can maybe penetrate. I played knight e5. Knight back to e5 to cover the e3 square. I thought that was a more dangerous move, but he brings his queen into e4. And so anyway, I have to congratulate my opponent, even though, you know, he missed that tactic in the beginning and he's been a pawn down. He's still playing actively and and looking for those ideas. So that's the way to get stronger. You keep playing and always look for your chances. Anyway, I played f5 here, and that turns out to be a blunder. Although this one is not so easy to see. Both of us missed this. So let's see, what should I play here? Chess Engine is recommending rook c to e1. Just solidify over here on the king side before trying anything. I thought I was solid enough, but apparently not. And in fact, the exchange sacrifice we talked about earlier is now winning. And if you can spot this kind of idea, you're a much stronger player than me. Because like I said, neither of us saw this. But the rook takes, bishop takes, rook takes. I would have probably played rook f2, trying to defend the second rank. But there's a problem with rook f2, which is that the knight can take on f5. Look at this tactic. And then the bishop can come to h4, picking up this rook. And now with the queen and the rook here and my exposed king, he has threats after the exchange of skewering the queen and the rook here. Plus this knight is hanging after the exchange. So I move the queen, he takes the rook, I take back, he takes the knight with check. So he's just winning here. That's a complete bust. So if I don't play rook f2, maybe I need to do something about the knight here. So I drop the knight back. He can play rook d3, pinning the knight. And then let's say I can bring the rook over now, rook c to e1, hitting the queen. But he can take the knight off with check. And this is also just winning for black. He doesn't have to move his queen right away. He takes with check. And he's going to have two pieces against a rook at the end of all of this. So that would have been a shock if he had found that one. So let's back up to this position. This might be a position you would like to study. See if you could calculate ahead that far, because it is a pretty interesting idea. And if you can spot ideas like that during the game, you'll be a much stronger player. But that's something that's really hard for me to see. Also because earlier in the game, as I was saying, this pawn was solidly defended by the bishop, and I wasn't worried about the exchange sack. But now that I've opened it up, there's some dangerous threats there. In fact, black is winning in this position. But instead, he followed through with his plan. He had this idea with his knight and his queen. He followed up with knight g2. It was also a pretty dangerous move, and I had to struggle to find the best move here. He is just threatening to take my bishop, and he's also got his bishop coming in, either to this square or to this square. It's looking pretty dangerous for me, so I need to find a good move here. And also this was a bit of a shock, because when I played f5, I didn't mention this, but f5 came with a big threat. Can you see what I was threatening after playing f5? Okay, yeah, pause the video if you don't see white's threat here, because you should be able to find it. I'm going to give the answer away now. What I was threatening was rook to f4, and his queen is just trapped there. That's why I thought that f5 move was so attractive, and it turns out to be a game-losing blunder. But this idea of trapping the queen was really appealing to me, and I thought for sure I was just winning the game at this point. And then knight to g2. That's why I was reminded of that suddenly. Not only does it attack the bishop, but it also controls the f4 square, so I can't play rook f4 and hit the queen like that, trap it. So he survives with his queen, and I have to struggle to find a good move here. So anyway, the bishop is just hanging at this point, so he's got the queen and the knight on it. So I need to do something about that. So if you want to see if you can spot the best move here. Okay, I'm giving the answer away now. The move I played turns out to be the best move, so I found another good move here. It's dropping the bishop all the way back to g1. I don't want to block in the rook. I need to have that rook available to control squares around my king and maybe keep threats going against the f-pawn. Didn't want to leave the bishop there and have it traded. I need to keep the bishop on this diagonal to defend this pawn. And so this seems to hold everything. And now if he plays bishop to h4, I'll just take the knight. In fact, he played a better move. He played bishop to g5. But I still take the knight. So I managed to come out of this with 2 pieces for the rook with best play. But and so now he needs to trade queens. His queen is hanging and take my rook. That's probably the way the game should proceed. But instead, he picked up this bishop and he moved it all the way down here. And then he moved it back and set it down. And then after thinking for a while, he picked up his queen and tried to move it. And I said, you can't do that. That's you touched your bishop. You can't move another piece. You don't have to take the rook here. There's other moves the bishop has, but he picked the bishop off the ground and moved it halfway across the board. So it was clearly not a mistake. So he said, I said adjust. And I said, it doesn't matter. You picked up that bishop with the intent to move it. You got to move it. That's the touch move rule. So he went and got the tournament director. He didn't accept my explanation. And the tournament director came over and said, yeah, he's got to move the bishop. So anyway, he was a little bit flustered by that, I guess, and he just took the rook here. But that's a horrible move. That loses the queen. There is a better move here if you can find the best idea for black in this position. Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. You could play bishop f4 check. You had to move the bishop because you touched it, but you don't have to necessarily take. And it's okay what he did. Everything he did was okay up to a certain point, right? If you pick a piece up and you move it across the board and you realize it's a mistake, you can move it back and set it down. But you just have to remember this piece is the piece you have to move. You've touched it, you've got to move it. So you can set it down while you think about it, and then you pick it back up and move it where you want to. But you can't move another piece. And saying adjust doesn't change that. Anyway, so the better move here was bishop f4 check. And then I move my king. Then he can trade queens. And he can get into this position, which is the best he could have hoped for in any case. And this is winning for white. Now his exchange sacrifices ideas don't work. I have 2 pieces for the rook and an extra pawn. So it's a winning endgame, but it would be a long game still. And the way I was playing, there were still possibilities of more blunders. But anyway, he took the rook after the excitement. I took his queen. And he did play on, but there was nothing going on here. I'll just go through the last few moves here. Let's see, what did he do? He played rook e8 here. So I just took his bishop. He won my knight. And I unpin. He takes. Play rook back to f1. I'm just lining up against his king. I'm going to push this pawn forward and checkmate him on one of these files, I guess. He played rook takes d4, forgetting about the bishop, perhaps. I played bishop takes rook, and then he resigned. So anyway, interesting game. I have to say that his play was pretty good. So he was, he was a solid Class B player. He just needed to play. He needed to know his rules better. Saying adjust does not excuse everything. I think other than that, he didn't try to lie and pretend he didn't touch it or didn't move it. He said, yeah, I moved it, but then I said adjust. that doesn't count. So I think he was honestly mistaken there, I guess. And he played a pretty good game. He didn't get too upset when he was down in material. He played on, but he needs to play a little more cautiously if he's going to make the move up to Class A. So I'd say he's a solid Class B player based on his play. And his results in the tournament, he scored, he lost the next round, so he started off pretty badly. Maybe he was still a little upset after that game, after this first game. But then in the final 4 rounds, he scored 2.5 points. So he ended up at 2.5 out of 6. and his rating improved a little bit. It went from 1658 to 1660. So it was not a terrible tournament for him. He held his own, and I think he'll do okay in the future if he just plays a little more cautiously. He was definitely thinking. He wasn't playing too fast. Just needs to think about the right things, as do we all. Anyway, that's it for this game, and stay tuned for round two coverage coming up.